Welcome to Dark History, the channel where the shadows of the past come alive. Today, we journey into the life of a man whose name struck fear across the known world, a man whose very presence could make emperors tremble, armies flee, and cities burn. His name was Attila the Hun. Imagine a world where empires rise and fall in the blink of an eye, a world where the horse and the bow decide the fate of nations. In the 5th century, one man stood at the center of that storm, a ruler of unmatched ambition and ruthless power. Attila was not just a warrior, he was a force of nature, a living terror, a shadow across Europe that no city could ignore. He destroyed cities. He crushed armies. He demanded tribute from emperors, bending them to his will. He marched across Gaul. He invaded Italy, and wherever he went, he left only fear and ash in his wake. To the Romans, he was the Scourge of God. To his people, he was a king, a unifier, a ruler like no other. But who was Attila really? Was he merely a barbarian, a destroyer without mercy? Or was he a calculated strategist, a visionary leader whose empire shook the foundations of the ancient world? Over the next chapters, we will dive deep into his life, his empire, his battles, and the legends that grew from his fearsome name. From the steppes of Central Asia to the gates of Rome, from the blood-soaked plains of Gaul to the mystery of his final night. This is the story of Attila the Hun. Prepare yourself. History will show you a man who could conquer continents, terrify the world, and remember. If you want more tales from the shadows of history, subscribe to Dark History and hit the bell icon, because the past is darker than you think. Chapter 1: The Shadow of the Steppes. The story begins not with Attila himself, but with the silence that came before him. Imagine Europe in the early 5th century, a land in turmoil. Rome, once unshakable, now trembled under the weight of its own corruption, betrayal, and decay. The eternal city was no longer eternal in strength. Its borders cracked like brittle stone, its armies stretched thin, its emperors desperate and weak. In the east, Constantinople glittered, a jewel of defiance, yet haunted by shadows creeping from the endless plains beyond. And then there was the steppe, an ocean of grass that stretched farther than the imagination could carry. An endless horizon, winds whispering across wild fields. A place where empires could not build walls high enough, nor armies large enough to contain what lurked within. From that steppe, the Huns came. For the Romans, the Huns were not merely enemies. They were nightmares made flesh. No one knew exactly where they came from, their origins lost in the haze of rumor and legend. Some said they were demons born from the union of witches and wandering spirits. Others believed they had descended from the very edges of the world, beyond the realms of civilization. Their appearance was alien to the Roman eye, short, stocky, hardened by the saddle, their faces marked by scars and strange rituals, their eyes burning with unyielding ferocity, and they moved like ghosts across the land, swift, merciless, unstoppable. They struck suddenly, vanishing before an empire could react. There were whispers on the wind, fire in the night, thunder across the plains. It was into this world of terror and uncertainty that a boy named Attila was born. The whisper of a name. The birth of Attila was not recorded with the pomp and ceremony that followed Roman emperors. There were no marble inscriptions, no scribes to etch his first cries into history. He was born into obscurity, in the heart of the steppe, among a people who lived not in palaces, but in tents of felt and leather. His cradle was the earth itself, his lullaby the howling wind. But even then, legends grew around him. The old warriors spoke of omens that had appeared in the skies, strange lights, storms rolling over the horizon with unnatural fury. Shamans muttered of destiny, of a child who would rise not only to lead his people, but to bend the world itself to his will. Whether these stories were true or crafted later by those who feared him, no one can say. Yet, in the telling of history, It does not matter, for belief itself became part of his power. As a child, Attila would have known nothing of Rome. To him, the empire was a faraway land of stone cities and strange customs. His world was the horse, the bow, and the tribe. From the earliest age, Hun children were trained for war. They learned to ride before they could walk, to draw the bow before they could speak in full sentences. They ate hardened meat to strengthen their jaws, bore scars with pride, and lived under a sky that offered no protection, only challenge. The boy grew into a youth, hardened not by luxury, but by survival. The Huns did not dream of wealth or art. They dreamed of conquest, of the raid, of the hunt, and Attila learned quickly. His eyes missed nothing. His silence, his composure, made him stand apart. Even as a child, he seemed older than his years, as though something ancient had settled inside him, waiting to awaken. Rome in the twilight. Meanwhile, the Roman world was unraveling. By the time Attila reached youth, the empire had already split, east and west. The Western Roman Empire stumbled from crisis to crisis, battered by Germanic tribes, torn apart by weak leadership. Its legions were shadows of their former glory, its coffers nearly empty. In the east, Constantinople stood strong, its walls defiant, its emperors cunning, but even there, the specter of the Huns cast a long shadow. The Romans, for all their arrogance, feared the Huns unlike any other foe. The Goths and Vandals they could fight, the Persians they could negotiate with, but the Huns were something different, unpredictable, alien, savage. They did not build cities, did not farm land, did not worship gods Rome could understand. They were the anti-civilization, the dark mirror of everything Rome claimed to be. When Attila was still a young man, the Huns were already making their presence felt. They had stormed across the plains, crushing tribes that dared resist, forcing others to join them. The Goths, once powerful, had fled westward, slamming into Roman borders like waves against a failing dam. Rome was not only fighting the barbarians at its gates, it was fighting the consequences of the Huns behind them. Attila was learning, watching, waiting. The brothers of the steppe history often forgets that Attila was not alone. In the beginning, he ruled with his brother, Bleda. Together, they inherited a rising empire, not an empire of marble and columns, but of horsemen and fire. The Huns were not a unified people in the Roman sense. They were a coalition of tribes, bound together by fear and loyalty to strength. And Attila, even as a young man, understood this better than anyone. The brothers struck deals with Rome, playing emperor against emperor. They demanded tribute, gold by the cartload, in exchange for peace, and Rome paid, for it was cheaper to buy off the Huns than to face them in battle. Each coin that flowed into Hun hands was another step toward the shadow empire Attila would build. But peace never lasted long. The Huns thrived on tension, on keeping their enemies in fear, and in those moments, Attila revealed his gift, not just as a warrior, but as a strategist. He knew when to strike and when to wait, when to roar and when to whisper. His presence was magnetic, his words sharp. Among his people, he was not just a leader. He was destiny incarnate. The shape of fear. Though Romans had many enemies, but none quite like Attila. He was not merely a man of war. He was a symbol of the chaos Rome feared most. To the civilized world, he was the barbarian at the gate, the shadow beyond the firelight. Yet, to his own people, he was order itself, the one who gave purpose to the chaos, who turned scattered tribes into a storm that could sweep across empires. Even his enemies spoke of him with a kind of awe. They described his appearance, small in stature, swarthy, broad of chest, with a flat nose and deep-set eyes. He was not handsome, not imposing in the Roman sense, but there was something about him, a presence that silenced rooms, that made men hesitate before speaking. And above all, there was his mind, cold, calculating, relentless. Attila understood fear better than anyone, and he wielded it like a weapon sharper than any sword. The gathering storm by the time whispers of his name began to spread beyond the steppe. Attila was already building something larger than himself. He had turned the Huns from raiders into rulers, from shadows into a storm. Gold flowed into his camp, warriors rallied to his banner, and Rome, mighty Rome, found itself trapped between appeasement and annihilation. The chronicles of the time describe the terror vividly. Villages burned, cities emptied at the mere rumor of the Huns' approach. Refugees flooded Roman lands, their stories painting images of inhuman horsemen who ate raw flesh, who knew no mercy, who descended like wolves upon the fold. Attila did not need to fight to win. His reputation rode ahead of him, breaking defenses before his arrows ever flew. He was becoming a myth, and myths are more dangerous than armies. The cliffhanger, but this is only the beginning. Attila was still a rising force, his true fury yet to be unleashed. The world had not yet seen the Scourge of God in full. The boy from the steppes had become a leader. The leader was becoming a conqueror, and soon, the conqueror would become a terror that shook the very foundations of Europe. As the winds of the steppe howled, and Rome's walls quivered, a shadow loomed over the horizon, a name whispered in fear, a destiny written in fire, and a question that would haunt history forever. Was Attila truly the savage monster Rome described, or the brilliant warlord who revealed the empire's crumbling truth? The answer lay in the chapters yet to come. Chapter 2. The Blood Pact of Brothers. The bond of blood is both the strongest chain and the sharpest blade. For Attila the Hun, it would prove to be both. When Attila came of age, the Huns were already feared across the frontier. They were not yet an empire, not yet a storm at full strength, but they were a force impossible to ignore. The Goths had been driven westward. Rome was weakened by waves of refugees, and the steppe tribes bent their knees to a rising Hun coalition. At the center of this fragile storm stood two men, brothers by birth, leaders by inheritance, Attila and Bleda. Brothers of the steppe, Attila and Bleda were nephews of Rugila, an earlier Hun king who had bound the tribes together through fear and conquest. When Rugila died, the throne, if one could call it that, for the Huns had no marble halls, only the wide plains, passed to his nephews. Two brothers, sharing not only blood but destiny. But brothers in power rarely remain equals. The chronicles describe them as opposites. Bleda, the elder, was boisterous, commanding, a man who sought to enjoy the spoils of rule. He loved the trappings of wealth, the feasts, the gold, the submission of envoys. Attila, in contrast, was reserved, deliberate, a man of silence who calculated before he struck. If Bleda embodied the thunder, Attila embodied the lightning, unseen until it struck with deadly force. And yet, in the beginning, they ruled side by side. Together, they carried forward Rugila's legacy. Together, they sharpened the Hun blade. A world in crisis. Rome was watching. The death of Rugila had offered a moment of hope. Perhaps the Hun menace would fracture. Perhaps rival tribes would turn on one another. But the opposite happened. Attila and Bleda stepped into their uncle's place with ruthless efficiency, maintaining control, even expanding it. In 435, the brothers signed a treaty with the Eastern Roman Empire at Margus, in modern-day Serbia. The Romans agreed to pay an enormous tribute, 700 pounds of gold each year, to keep the Huns from raiding their lands. It was not a peace born of friendship, but of fear. The empire bought time with gold, hoping to hold the storm at bay, but Attila and Bleda did not see tribute as submission. They saw it as strategy. Each coin was a soldier's loyalty, purchased, a weapon forged, a horse fed. The Romans believed they were pacifying the Huns. In truth, they were arming them. The treaty also contained darker clauses. Rome agreed to return any Hun fugitives who sought asylum within imperial lands. For the Huns' loyalty was absolute, and desertion unforgivable. The thought of runaways finding safety behind Roman walls was intolerable. Attila and Bleda demanded their return, and Rome agreed. Those who fled were dragged back to the steppe, where no mercy awaited them. The brothers had secured more than gold. They had secured obedience, the blood oath among the Huns. Loyalty was sealed, not only with words, but with blood. Warriors swore oaths by cutting their flesh, letting drops fall into goblets of wine, mixing blood with drink to bind themselves in eternal unity. Such rituals were not mere symbols. They were sacred. It is said that Attila and Bleda shared such a pact, not only as brothers, but as co-rulers. They were the dual heads of a serpent, striking in unison against Rome. Yet even as they drank from the same cup, even as they vowed unity before their people, tension simmered beneath the surface. For in the steppe, there is room only for one sun in the sky. The mask of peace, the Treaty of Margus held for a time. Rome, desperate to avoid conflict, poured gold into Hun hands. For nearly 5 years, the frontier remained relatively quiet. The Romans called this peace. Attila and Bleda called it preparation. Behind the facade of calm, the Huns grew stronger. They built alliances with lesser tribes, forcing submission through fear. They trained relentlessly, honing the art of mounted warfare. Each Hun warrior could fire arrows with deadly precision while riding at full gallop, loosing shafts faster than Roman infantry could raise their shields. Their horses were hardy, bred for endurance, carrying them across vast distances at terrifying speed. The Huns did not merely fight wars, they perfected the storm, and Attila, always watching, always calculating, was preparing for the moment when peace would no longer serve him. Betrayal at Margus. That moment came in 4 for 1. The Treaty of Margus was broken, not by the Huns, but by Rome itself. A Roman bishop, acting without imperial sanction, desecrated Hun graves across the Danube. To the Huns, the disturbance of the dead was the gravest insult imaginable. The treaty had also guaranteed the return of fugitives, yet Rome failed to comply, offering sanctuary to those Attila demanded. For Attila and Bleda, this was no longer politics. This was blood vengeance. The brothers unleashed their armies. The Huns swept into Roman territory with fire and fury. Cities fell like stalks of wheat before the scythe. Margus, the very site of the treaty, was among the first to be destroyed, a deliberate symbol, a reminder that no promise could shield Rome from the wrath of the steppe. The chronicles describe the terror vividly: towns emptied, rivers choked with bodies, fields burning under black smoke. Roman legions, once the pride of the world, faltered against the speed and savagery of the Hun horsemen. Constantinople itself trembled, its people fearing the day the Huns would appear at its gates. Rome begged for peace. The empire agreed to an even greater tribute, an astonishing 2,100 pounds of gold each year. The Huns had not only avenged their honor, they had tripled their wealth. Brothers in shadow victory brought glory, yet glory also brings division. Attila and Bleda stood at the height of their joint power. Their coffers overflowed with Roman gold. Their warriors were more numerous than ever. Their enemies cowered before them. But within the campfires of the steppe, whispers began to rise. Some said Bleda was growing arrogant, careless, too enamored with feasts and plunder. Others claimed Attila's silence hid ambition, that he saw no need for a brother beside him. The truth is lost to time, but history is clear on one point: their unity would not last. By 445, Bleda was dead. The sources differ on how. Some claim Attila murdered him, seizing power for himself. Others suggest Bleda fell in battle, or died in an accident. But the result was the same. Attila stood alone. The serpent had shed its second head. Attila, alone, with his brother gone. Attila wasted no time. He assumed absolute control of the Huns, and the storm he unleashed would be greater than anything Rome had yet faced. But in this moment, in the death of Bleda, In the silence that followed, a transformation occurred. Attila was no longer merely a co-ruler, no longer the shadow beside another. He was the shadow itself, vast and unchallenged. The single figure at the center of a whirlwind. The chronicles record his ruthlessness, but also his discipline. Attila was not a man who indulged in luxury. He ate and drank sparingly, dressed in simple clothing, and lived as his warriors did. His tent was plain compared to the ornate feasts of other chieftains. He ruled not by excess, but by fear, respect, and iron control. And fear, Attila knew, was the most powerful currency in history. The cliffhanger, the death of Bleda, marked the birth of something far greater, the rise of Attila the Hun as the sole master of his people. His eyes turned westward, toward Rome itself. The tribute had made him wealthy. The alliances had made him strong, but wealth and strength meant nothing without conquest. The shadow of the steppe was ready to spread across the world, and Rome, fragile, fractured, and fearful, was about to feel the full force of the Scourge of God. The blood of brothers had sealed Attila's path. The question now was not whether he would strike, but when. Chapter 3. The Scourge of God awakens. Silence often follows the death of a king, but when Bleda vanished from the chronicles of history, there was no silence, only the sound of hoofbeats. The year was 445. The Huns, a storm already feared across Europe, now looked to a single leader. Attila stood alone, his brother gone, the rival head of power severed like a snake cut in half. Whether by accident, disease, or the edge of Attila's ambition, Bleda's death left no question. There was only one master of the steppe, and his name would soon echo in terror across the known world. A king without excess. The chronicles of Attila are filled with contradictions. To his enemies, he was a monster, a barbarian who swept across the land like a plague. To his people, he was a leader who bound them with iron will and ruthless justice. Yet one image stands out, written by the Roman historian Priscus, who visited Attila's court in the 440s. Priscus expected luxury. He had seen the courts of Roman emperors, the wealth of Constantinople, the excess of generals and kings. Surely the most feared man in the world would live in splendor, feasting upon gold, seated upon a throne of power. Instead, he found simplicity. Attila dined on plain meat served on wooden plates, while his guests ate from silver and gold. His clothing was unadorned, his tent modest, his life stripped of extravagance. He drank sparingly, never dulling his mind with wine, never clouding his judgment. This was not the excess of Rome. This was discipline, control, a king who lived as his warriors lived. In this simplicity lay power, for Attila's men saw in him not weakness, but strength. A leader who needed no gilded mask, no luxury to prove his dominance. His authority came not from wealth, but from fear and respect. The fear of a name-it was during these years that Attila's reputation transformed from that of a mere warlord into something greater, something closer to myth. The Romans gave him a name that would endure for centuries. Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God, to the Christian world. Battered by plague, famine, and the collapse of Rome's former glory, Attila was not simply an enemy. He was a punishment sent from heaven, a divine scourge upon a sinful people. His arrival was seen as judgment itself, a reminder that the empire's arrogance had earned divine wrath. The Huns embraced this reputation. Fear spread faster than armies, and Attila understood its value. Villages would surrender before his horsemen arrived. Cities would empty at the mere rumor of his presence. To be feared was to win without fighting, and Attila wielded fear as a weapon sharper than any blade. Rome trembles by now. Rome was no longer the Rome of Caesar or Augustus. The Western Empire teetered on the brink of ruin, its borders shattered, its emperors little more than pawns in the hands of generals and foreign mercenaries. The Eastern Empire, wealthier and more resilient, still stood strong in Constantinople. But even behind its massive walls, the people quaked at the whisper of Attila's name. The tribute paid in gold, once seen as a way to contain the Huns, had only fed the beast. With each payment, Attila grew stronger, his armies larger, his confidence bolder, and he was not content with tribute alone. Attila demanded submission, not merely gold, but recognition that Rome itself, the so-called master of the world, would bow before him. The machinery of the Huns were unlike any enemy Rome had faced. They were not bound by roads or supply lines, not slowed by siege engines or baggage trains. They were the wind, moving swiftly, striking suddenly, disappearing before legions could respond. Their horses were small, but fierce, capable of traveling incredible distances without rest. Their bows, crafted from wood, horn, and sinew, had a deadly power, able to pierce armor at ranges Roman archers could not match. Entire armies could be broken by volleys loosed from horseback, rainstorms of death falling before the enemy could even engage. But it was not just their weapons. It was their way of war. The Huns thrived on terror. They struck not only to conquer, but to annihilate morale. Villages burned not out of necessity, but out of message. Survivors were left alive to spread stories of horror. The very sound of hoofbeats became enough to drive populations into panic. And at the center of this storm sat Attila, calculating, relentless. The diplomacy of Shadow's Attila was not only a warrior, he was also a master of diplomacy. His envoys rode to Constantinople with demands that grew with each passing year. Gold, prisoners, fugitives, trade rights, each request larger than the last. Each refusal answered with devastation. But Attila was shrewd. He never asked for more than Rome could give. He knew the balance to bleed the empire, but not to kill it too soon. For a dead Rome could not pay gold, and Attila desired both conquest and wealth. The emperors of Constantinople alternated between appeasement and defiance. But each time they faltered, Attila struck. He used negotiation as a weapon, always leaving Rome uncertain whether peace or destruction lay ahead. The legend grows by the late 440s. Attila was no longer merely a threat at the borders. He was the defining figure of his age. His name was spoken in whispers across Europe, from the forests of Germania to the coasts of Gaul. Mothers frightened their children into obedience by invoking him. Hush, or Attila will come. And yet, among his people, he was revered. He was not a tyrant who ruled through cruelty alone. He rewarded loyalty, shared in hardship, and embodied the strength they admired. To his warriors, he was no monster. He was the protector of their way of life. The shield of the Huns against the arrogance of Rome. The gathering storm, the death of Bleda, had marked the beginning of a new era. Now Attila stood unchallenged, his empire stretching from the plains of Central Asia to the edges of Europe. He commanded not only Huns, but subject tribes who feared his wrath more than they desired freedom. His banner was followed by tens of thousands, his horsemen darkening the horizon like a living storm. But Attila was not yet satisfied. Gold and tribute were not enough. Fear was not enough. The Scourge of God hungered for more, and so, his gaze turned once more toward Constantinople, toward the glittering jewel of the Eastern Empire, the city whose walls had never fallen. The question was not whether he would strike, but how. The cliffhanger. The chronicles tell us that when Attila rode, the earth trembled, and when he camped, the plains turned to ash. But even the mightiest storm must choose its path. Would Attila break the walls of Constantinople? Would he burn the jewel of the East? Or would he turn his fury westward, against the crumbling shadow of Rome itself? The Scourge of God had awakened. The world waited in dread, and the darkness of his reign was only beginning. Chapter 4. The Eastern Empire under siege. The Danube River, wide and glimmering, had long been the line between civilization and chaos. On its southern banks stood the Roman world, weary, battered, yet still proud. To the north stretched the open plains, where the horsemen of the Huns gathered like storm clouds. By the year 447, that storm had broken. Attila had decided that the time for negotiation was over. Tribute alone no longer satisfied him. He wanted more land, submission, and the humiliation of Constantinople itself. And so, the Huns prepared to unleash one of the most devastating campaigns the Eastern Roman Empire had ever endured. A river of fear, the Danube, was no barrier to Attila. His horsemen surged across in waves, cutting down defenses, destroying forts, and burning villages. The Romans had built stone walls and watchtowers along the frontier, but against the relentless tide of the Huns, they crumbled like sandcastles before the sea. City after city fell. Marcianopolis, Sardica, Naissus, names carved into the Roman map for centuries, were reduced to smoking ruins. Survivors fled in terror, carrying with them the same haunting refrain: "The Huns are coming." For many, resistance was unthinkable. The mere shadow of Attila's army was enough to open gates, enough to empty towns before a single arrow was loosed. Terra had become his most reliable general. The earth trembles, and then, as if the heavens themselves had turned against Rome, nature struck. In 447, a massive earthquake tore through the Balkans. Walls cracked, fortifications collapsed, entire cities lay exposed. Even Constantinople, the mighty jewel of the East, saw its once impenetrable Theodosian walls fractured and broken. For Attila, it was a sign. For Rome, it was a nightmare. Before repairs could be completed, the Huns were upon them. Like wolves, scenting blood, they pressed forward, exploiting every weakness, every breach, every gap left by the earth's fury. The unstoppable march prescribed. The Roman historian who witnessed these years painted a picture of devastation unmatched in living memory. The Huns moved with speed and precision, their cavalry striking deep, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, leaving famine in their wake. The Eastern Roman field armies, battered by defeats and stretched thin across vast frontiers, could do little to stop them. Every attempt at resistance was shattered by the mobility of Attila's horsemen. The empire's heartland itself lay exposed. The road to Constantinople was open. Constantinople and Perillum. Imagine the scene in Constantinople. The golden domes of the city shimmer in the sunlight, but beneath them, fear rules. The streets are filled with whispers, refugees pouring in with tales of horror, priests declaring that divine punishment has arrived, soldiers scrambling to repair walls still trembling from the earthquake. On the horizon, the dust of Attila's host rises. Tens of thousands of horsemen, banners fluttering like flames, the sound of drums echoing like thunder. Never before had Constantinople faced such a threat. The city's walls, 3 layers thick, had withstood sieges for a century. But now, with cracks still unhealed, even the mighty Theodosian walls seemed fragile. And yet, Attila did not assault the city directly. The shadow of strategy. Attila was not a fool. He understood that even damaged, Constantinople's defenses were formidable. Siege warfare was not the strength of the Huns. They thrived in open battle, in rapid strikes, in the terror of mobility. To become bogged down in a prolonged siege would drain his strength, cost him the advantage. Instead, he chose to strangle the empire. Attila ravaged the countryside, cutting supply lines, destroying towns, making it clear that Constantinople might survive, but only as an island in a sea of fire. The Eastern Emperor, Theodosius II, faced a terrible choice: resist and risk annihilation, or yield once more to the demands of the Scourge of God. Rome buys survival land, so gold once again changed hands. Theodosius agreed to terms that would have humiliated any proud ruler. The tribute demanded by Attila tripled. Prisoners were handed over. Borderlands were abandoned. The empire bled wealth at a staggering rate, sending carts of treasure northward, not in victory. But in desperation, it was survival, bought not by courage, but by coin. Yet, Theodosius was not content to be humiliated forever. Even as the gold flowed to Attila, the emperor plotted in secret. He tried to stir rebellion among Attila's vassals, sent agents to whisper treachery into the ears of subject tribes, and even considered assassination. But Attila's network of spies was vast. The plots were uncovered, the agents exposed, and Attila's fury grew hotter. Theodosius had bought time, but at a terrible cost. His empire was weakened, his people demoralized, his coffers drained. The limits of power. Despite his devastation, Attila had not broken Constantinople. Its walls, even cracked, remained standing. Its people, though fearful, endured. The city, that shining prize of the East, remained beyond his grasp, and Attila knew it. For all his terror, for all his victories, even he could not reduce Constantinople without weapons he did not possess. Siege engines, naval power, patience. These were tools of Rome, not the horsemen of the steppe. So he did what the Huns always did best. He withdrew, carrying with him unimaginable wealth, leaving behind only ashes and the echo of hooves. The turning of the gaze. But Attila was not defeated. Far from it. Each campaign had strengthened his legend, enriched his coffers, and reminded the Romans that their survival depended not on strength, but on his mercy. And yet, mercy was not infinite. If Constantinople could not be taken, then perhaps Rome itself, the Western Empire, fragile and crumbling, would offer the glory he sought. His gaze shifted westward, to Gaul, to Italy, to the ancient city whose name had once ruled the world. The Scourge of God had tested the East. Now, he would march against the West. The cliffhanger, the Danube, smoked behind him. The Balkans lay in ruin. Constantinople had endured, but only barely. And somewhere, deep within his mind, Attila must have smiled. For while the walls of Constantinople had denied him, they had not broken him. The world had not yet seen the full fury of the Huns. Rome had survived, but its time was running out, and soon, the eternal city itself would tremble beneath the shadow of Attila the Hun. Chapter 5. The Invasion of Gaul. The year was 451. The world held its breath. From the plains of Pannonia to the forests of Germania, rumors spread like wildfire. Attila, the Scourge of God, was on the move again. But this time, his target was not Constantinople or the Eastern Empire. His gaze had shifted westward, toward the rich provinces of Gaul, the heartland of the crumbling Western Roman Empire. The Huns, it was said, had crossed the Rhine. Towns vanished overnight. Smoke rose on the horizon. And for the first time in generations, Gaul braced itself for an enemy that seemed less like an army and more like a force of nature. The spark of war. What drove Attila into Gaul? Historians disagree. Some point to the endless hunger for tribute and plunder. Others whisper of politics, of a Princess Honoria, sister to the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, who allegedly sent Attila a desperate plea for rescue from her arranged marriage. In her letter, she is said to have offered not only her hand, but half the Western Empire as her dowry. Whether true or not, Attila seized upon the claim as a righteous excuse for invasion. He would come, he declared, not as a conqueror, but as a bridegroom, to claim what was his by right. Rome laughed at the notion, but behind the laughter was fear. For Attila never asked twice. The gathering storm from the steppes. Attila summoned his vast coalition: Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Alans, Rugians, Syrians, tribes bound not by love, but by fear and loyalty to his banner. Together, they formed one of the most diverse and terrifying armies Europe had ever seen. Chroniclers speak of tens of thousands of horsemen, the ground trembling under their hooves, their arrows blotting out the sun. Alongside them marched infantry drawn from conquered tribes. men who fought not for Attila's glory, but for survival. It was less an army than a tidal wave, and it rolled westward with unstoppable momentum. The Western Empire, once master of the world, was a shadow of itself. The Western Empire had been bled dry by decades of invasions, usurpations, and betrayals. Its borders cracked, its armies scattered, its treasury near empty. Emperor Valentinian III, weak and indecisive, could do little but panic. The real power lay in the hands of his general, Flavius Idius, a man who had once lived among the Huns as a hostage, who knew their ways, who had bargained and fought with them for decades. It would be Idius, not Valentinian, who would bear the burden of salvation. An unlikely alliance. Idius understood a grim truth. Rome could not face Attila alone. The Western legions, diminished and exhausted, would shatter under the Hun assault. If Gaul was to be saved, Rome needed allies, and so Idius turned to an old enemy, the Visigoths. Settled in Aquitaine, the Goths had been both foes and allies of Rome in recent memory. Their king, Theodoric I, was proud, independent, and deeply suspicious of Roman intentions. Yet even Theodoric could see the danger. If Attila conquered Gaul, the Visigoths would be next. After tense negotiations, an alliance was struck. Rome and the Visigoths, joined by other Gallic tribes, would march together to stop the Scourge of God. It was an alliance born not of friendship, but of fear. The march through Galmine. Attila advanced like a storm. Cities fell, one after another. Metz, Auxerre, Troyes. At Metz, it is said, the Huns burned the cathedral to the ground on Easter Day, slaughtering worshippers in the streets. Smoke darkened the skies, refugees flooded the roads, and the terror of the Huns grew with every step. But one city defied him, Orleans. Bishop Ennius of Orleans, with a mix of courage and desperation, rallied his people to resist. Behind its walls, the citizens prayed for deliverance. Their only hope the arrival of Idius and the Visigoths. For days, Attila's host surrounded the city, battering at its gates, preparing to storm the walls. Victory seemed certain, and then dust appeared on the horizon. The clash of armies. Idius and Theodoric had arrived. Their combined forces marched upon Orleans, catching Attila off guard. The Hun army, masters of speed and surprise, now found themselves on the defensive. Attila ordered a retreat, pulling his men back to the plains of Catalaunian, near Chalons. There, the fate of Gaul would be decided. The stage is set. Imagine the scene. On one side, Attila's vast host, banners whipping in the wind, drums pounding, horsemen lined in endless rows. At the center, the great warlord himself, seated in his war chariot, eyes burning with the fury of conquest. On the other, the uneasy alliance of Rome and the Visigoths. Their soldiers, knowing they faced not only death, but annihilation, should they fail. At their head rode Idius. And calculating, and Theodoric, fiery and proud. The Catalaunian plains would become the theater of one of the last great battles of the ancient world. The cliffhanger as dusk settled over the fields. The two armies prepared for the coming storm. Fires burned across the horizon, the ground shook with the stamping of horses, and the cries of warriors echoed into the night. The air was thick with dread, with anticipation, with the weight of history itself. For when dawn came, the plains would run red with blood, and the world would discover whether Attila the Hun could be stopped. Chapter 6. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. The sun rose over the fields near Chalons, turning the plains a dull gold. But beneath that calm glow, an atmosphere of dread hung heavy. Two armies, one forged of fear and fire, the other, bound by desperation and fragile alliance, faced one another across the open ground. The stage was set for one of the bloodiest battles of the ancient world. The calm, before the storm. On one side, Attila's horde. The banners of the Huns stretched like a sea, their horsemen restless, their bows strung tight. Attila himself sat in a great wooden war wagon, grim and silent, his face lit only by the fire of his ambition. Chroniclers later claimed he performed sacrifices that morning, hurling omens into the flames, searching for signs of victory. On the other side stood the combined armies of Rome and the Visigoths. Flavius Idius, Rome's last great general, directed his forces with icy precision. King Theodoric of the Visigoths rode among his warriors, shouting words of courage. His very presence, a spark that ignited their pride. The earth seemed to hold its breath. The opening movements, the Huns struck first. With the blare of horns and the pounding of drums, waves of cavalry thundered across the plains. Their arrows darkened the skies. A deadly rain designed to shatter formations before sword met shield. But this time, the Romans and Goths held. Shield walls braced, spears angled, arrows answered with arrows. The Visigoths, fierce and stubborn, refused to yield ground. The battle became a roar, the clash of iron, the cries of men, the thunder of horses shaking the very earth. The center collapses for hours. The lines surged back and forth, neither side gaining the upper hand. Then, Attila unleashed his full fury at the Roman center. Wave after wave of Hun horsemen crashed forward, driving deep into Idius's lines. The Roman troops, worn thin from years of decline, began to waver. Some broke and fled. A gap threatened to open. Attila pressed harder, sensing victory. But Idius, calm as ever, had anticipated this. He relied not on Roman strength, but on the Visigoths at his side. The death of a king on the right flank, Theodoric led his warriors into the thick of battle. Old, but unyielding, he rode at the front, his sword flashing, his voice carrying above the chaos. The Visigoths followed him with a ferocity that shook even the Huns. But then tragedy struck. Amid the storm of arrows and blades, Theodoric fell, trampled by horses, pierced by spears. His death was a blow that could have shattered Visigoth resolve. Instead, it lit a fire. Theodoric's son, Thorismund, seized command. Shouting vengeance for his fallen father, he led a brutal charge that ripped through Attila's flank, driving the Huns back step by bloody step. The momentum shifted. Attila's army, once unstoppable, found itself pressed on all sides. The ground piled with the dead. The noise of battle was a constant thunder. The Huns, for the first time in memory, were not advancing. They were struggling to survive. Attila withdrew to his wagon, ringed by his guards, and prepared for the worst. Some say he built a massive funeral pyre of saddles, vowing that if defeat came, he would throw himself into the flames rather than be captured. But fate spared him. Nightfall on the plains as darkness fell. The fighting slowed. The field was a graveyard, tens of thousands of bodies strewn across the earth, the air thick with the stench of death. Neither side claimed clear victory, but one truth could not be denied. Attila had been stopped. The Huns, undefeated for decades, had been checked on the plains of Gaul. Rome and her allies stood bloodied, but alive. The Visigoths mourned their fallen king, yet their vengeance had turned the tide. And Idius, with cold brilliance, held the fragile alliance together long enough to prevent Attila's triumph. The aftermath: when dawn came, Attila remained with his army, battered but unbroken. He had not been annihilated, but the legend of his invincibility had cracked. The Romans, cautious and wary, did not pursue too far. Idius himself, perhaps fearing that destroying Attila completely would leave the Visigoths too powerful, allowed the Huns to retreat. Thus the battle ended, not in total destruction, but in a stalemate soaked in blood. Yet history would remember it as one of the last great victories of Rome, and one of the few times the Scourge of God was forced to turn back. The cliffhanger: Attila had been denied his conquest of Gaul, but the warlord was not finished. His fury burned hotter than ever, and in his heart, he knew another prize remained, one far greater than the fields of Gaul, the eternal city itself, Rome. And soon, Attila the Hun would march upon Italy. Chapter 7. The road to Italy. The Catalonian plains still reeked of blood when Attila withdrew his armies. His men had not known defeat in living memory, and though he had survived the battle, the sting of stalemate gnawed at him. For the Scourge of God, to be denied, was intolerable. Gaul had resisted him, but Italy, the ancient heart of empire, the land where Rome itself still stood, now beckoned. And so, in 452, Attila turned his fury south. The wounded beast Attila was no longer invincible. The Battle of Chalons had shown cracks in his legend. Tribes whispered of the Visigoth charge that had broken his flank. Allies muttered that the Romans were not as weak as they seemed, but Attila understood fear better than anyone alive. And though the Huns had bled, their reputation still struck terror. Few dared resist openly when word spread that his banners were heading for Italy, for the people of the peninsula. It was as though a storm cloud darker than any before had descended from the north. The northern gates. The invasion began with the Alpine passes. Like torrents of water spilling through mountain cracks, Attila's host swept into the fertile plains of northern Italy. Aquileia was first. A strong and ancient city, it had resisted barbarians for centuries, but against Attila, resistance was futile. Chroniclers say the siege dragged on until, one day, Attila saw storks abandoning their nests upon the city walls. Taking it as an omen, he ordered a final assault. The walls fell. Aquileia was razed to the ground so completely that later travelers claimed they could scarcely find where the city had stood. The message was clear. Italy lay at Attila's mercy. The march of terror from Aquileia. Attila advanced deeper. Altinum, Concordia, Padua, Verona cities crumbled in his path. Where the Huns passed, fire followed. Refugees poured southward, carrying tales of horror. Families abandoned farms. Priests fled with relics. Whole communities vanished overnight. Some of these refugees would settle on the marshy islands of the Adriatic lagoon, where in time they would found a city called Venice, born out of fear of Attila the Hun. Rome trembles in Ravenna. The Western Emperor Valentinian III trembled. He had little power, little army, and little hope. His general Idius still commanded respect, but even he could not summon the strength to halt Attila's advance. Panic gripped the court. The eternal city itself, Rome, seemed within reach of the Scourge of God, and yet salvation would come from an unlikely place. The meeting on the Mincio. As Attila's horde approached the river Mincio, near Mantua, a strange embassy rode out to meet him. At its head was not a general, not an emperor, but a man of the church, Pope Leo I. The encounter has become one of the most mysterious moments of late antiquity. No eyewitness accounts survive, only later chronicles, half fact, half legend. But what is known is this: Attila, who had reduced cities to ashes, who had brought emperors to their knees, agreed to turn back after his meeting with the Pope. Why? The power of fear and faithsome, say Pope Leo's words, persuaded Attila that he reminded the Hun of divine judgment, of the futility of opposing the will of God. Others claim a miracle occurred, that Attila saw visions of St. Peter and St. Paul standing beside Leo, swords drawn, warning him away from Rome. Pragmatists argue the truth was simpler. Famine and disease had begun to ravage the Hun army, and Eastern Roman forces threatened his rear. To continue deeper into Italy risked disaster. Yet Attila never explained his choice. He simply turned his army back, leaving Rome untouched. The eternal city was spared, not by legions, not by walls, but by a single encounter between the Scourge of God and the Bishop of Rome, the shadow of mystery for the Romans. It was proof of divine favor. For Christians across the empire, it was a sign that faith could triumph where swords had failed. For Attila's enemies, it was a miracle the day God himself had stopped the Hun. But for Attila, it was a retreat wrapped in mystery. His fury had not dimmed, his ambition not cooled, yet something, be it faith, famine, or fear, had halted him at the gates of Rome, and the question remained, was it truly the voice of God that turned the scourge of God aside? The cliffhanger Attila returned to his stronghold across the Danube, richer than before, but unsatisfied. He had shaken Italy, frightened Rome, and left the world guessing at his reasons. But even as he planned his next campaign, fate prepared its final act for the warlord who had terrorized empires. The end of Attila was coming sudden, strange, and wrapped in as much mystery as his life. Chapter 8: Tribute and Terror. The Empire Pays. The year was 443 AD. The Eastern Roman Empire, powerful, wealthy, and seemingly eternal, stood, trembling before the thunder of hooves. In the east, Constantinople glittered like a jewel of marble and gold. But beyond its walls, a force was gathering that no city, no army, and no emperor could ignore. That force had a name that echoed like a curse. Attila. Attila had already demonstrated his power. His raids had burned towns, his warriors had cut through Roman legions with terrifying speed, and his demands had shaken the halls of Constantinople itself. But in this chapter of his story, we do not find him merely as a destroyer. Instead, we find him as something far more dangerous, a ruler who could bend an empire to his will without lifting a sword. The Eastern Roman emperors, weary of bloodshed, chose gold over steel. To them, tribute was cheaper than war. But for Attila, tribute was not merely a payment. It was a weapon, a declaration of Roman weakness, a public humiliation carved into the very foundations of their empire. Picture the scene. In Constantinople, envoys gathered in the vast audience hall of the emperor. The air was thick with incense, but also with dread. They carried heavy chests filled with Roman gold, each coin stamped with the proud image of imperial power. Yet as these coins crossed into Attila's hands, they became symbols of submission. Attila demanded more with every passing year. What began as a modest annual payment swelled into a fortune. The Huns became richer not by trade or agriculture, but by draining the wealth of the greatest empire in the world. And every coin the Romans gave him fed his armies, strengthened his court, and added to the legend of the man who called himself master of the Huns. The Romans despised this arrangement, but they feared the alternative. When envoys hesitated, Attila reminded them with fire and steel. Entire towns were reduced to ashes, their people slaughtered or dragged into captivity. Refugees flooded into Roman cities, their stories filled with horror, the blackened ruins of homes, the screams of children taken by horsemen who seemed to emerge from the very mists of the steppe. And so the empire paid. But Attila did not stop with gold. He demanded hostages, sons of noble families, taken from Constantinople and delivered to his court. These young men, raised in the wealth of the Roman elite, suddenly found themselves among the tents of the Huns, living in a world of leather, horseflesh, and iron. For Attila, these hostages were insurance. If the empire faltered in its payments, their lives would be forfeit. This was not only a financial burden, it was psychological warfare. The Romans, proud masters of civilization, were forced to treat with a man they once called barbarian. Every treaty signed with Attila was like a dagger plunged into Roman pride. It told the world that Rome was no longer invincible, that its emperors bowed to a horse, lord from the steppes, and Attila enjoyed this power. He knew the Romans feared him. He knew their gold was endless. And he knew that each tribute made him stronger while they grew weaker. Envoys who traveled to his camp wrote about the contrast between Attila and the world of Rome. While Roman emperors dazzled their audiences with gold thrones, jeweled crowns, and silken robes, Attila sat on a wooden stool, dressed in simple clothes, eating plain food. He was not poor. He chose simplicity as a weapon. It made him appear both humble and terrifying, a man untouched by luxury, focused only on conquest. One ambassador, Priscus of Panium, described Attila's court in vivid detail. He recalled the feasts where nobles dined from silver plates, yet Attila himself drank from a wooden cup. He remembered the silence that filled the hall when Attila spoke, the way warriors watched him with a mixture of fear and devotion. He was not a king in the Roman sense. He was something older, rawer, more primal, the living embodiment of the Huns themselves. This display of simplicity was more than personal taste. It was strategy. By refusing to indulge in luxury, Attila set himself apart from the Romans. He reminded everyone, his warriors, his envoys, even his enemies, that he was not weakened by wealth. He was strengthened by it, fueled by the tribute of empires, but never enslaved by it. Every tribute made Attila bolder. The sums demanded grew larger. When the Romans tried to bargain, Attila unleashed his armies once more. Villages burned, cities fell, and the rivers of Europe ran red. Tribute was not peace. It was a leash, and Attila held it tightly. The empire tried to resist through diplomacy. They sent envoys skilled in rhetoric, hoping to sway the Hun with words. They promised friendship, offered gifts, even tried to sow division among Attila's followers. But Attila was no fool. He saw through their lies, their attempts to manipulate. He listened, he smiled, but when the time came, he always demanded more, and the Romans paid. As the years passed, the balance of power shifted. The empire that once commanded legions across the known world now found itself on the defensive. The Eastern Roman Empire, rich and proud, became a tributary to a nomadic king from the steppes. It was a humiliation that echoed across the Mediterranean. But tribute was more than humiliation, it was preparation. Attila used Roman gold to strengthen his empire, to buy weapons, to reward his warriors, and to ensure loyalty. With every chest of coins, he transformed the wealth of Rome into the power of the Huns. He was building something larger than a raiding force. He was building a war machine capable of challenging the very heart of Europe. For the Romans, the question was no longer whether to pay, but how much longer they could afford to do so. Each coin bought time. Each treaty delayed disaster, but time was running out. The empire believed tribute would tame Attila, that it would satisfy his hunger, but they misunderstood him. Tribute was never the end goal. It was fuel. It was preparation. It was the foundation for something greater. For Attila had set his eyes not just on Constantinople, but on Rome itself. And as the gold flowed from the empire to the steppe, the Scourge of God grew stronger, waiting for the moment when tribute would no longer be enough, when terror would no longer be satisfied with payment. That moment was coming. The march westward was about to begin. Chapter 9. The March into Gaul. The year was 451 AD. For more than a decade, Rome had paid tribute to the Huns. Gold had flowed across the Danube in rivers, filling Attila's coffers, strengthening his armies, and feeding the legend of the Scourge of God. But now, tribute was no longer enough. The time had come for something greater, something that would shake the world. Attila's gaze turned westward to Gaul. Gaul, the land of wide rivers, rich towns, and fertile fields, was the beating heart of the Western Roman Empire. Though Rome itself still stood as a symbol of empire, Gaul was its backbone. It was here that the wealth of the provinces was collected, here that roads connected cities to legions, here that the remnants of Roman power still struggled to hold together a crumbling world. But Gaul was not simply Roman. It was a patchwork of powers. Visigoths ruled their own kingdom within its borders. Franks and Burgundians carved out territories of their own. Roman governors clung to cities, but their authority was weak. It was a land divided, fractured, waiting for a conqueror bold enough to take it. Attila knew this. He had studied Rome's weakness, and Gaul was the key. If he could break it, the West would collapse like a rotting tree. And so, in the spring of 451, the ground trembled with the march of the Huns. They came not as a single tribe, but as a storm. Huns on horseback, their bows curved like claws, their eyes sharp with hunger. But they were not alone. Attila commanded an alliance of peoples bound together by fear and ambition: Ostrogoths, Gepids, Syri, Rouge. Each tribe brought warriors, eager for plunder, driven by loyalty to the man who had bent them all to his will. It was not merely an army. It was a moving nation, hundreds of thousands strong, with warriors, families, wagons, and herds of animals. Wherever they passed, the land seemed to vanish: fields stripped bare, villages reduced to ashes, rivers fouled with the bodies of the dead. The Romans had seen raids before. They had paid tribute to avoid destruction. But this was different. This was not a raid. This was an invasion. The march began with fire. Cities along the Rhine fell one by one. Metz, a proud city of Gaul, was consumed by flames. Survivors told of streets littered with corpses, churches torn apart, and women dragged screaming into captivity. Priests begged for mercy, but Attila's army showed none. To the Huns, mercy was weakness, and weakness was death. Word spread like wildfire. Refugees flooded south and west, carrying stories of horror. In Roman villas, nobles trembled at the thought of the horsemen sweeping closer. In Gothic halls, chieftains weighed whether to fight Attila or to join him. Fear moved faster than his army, striking terror before a single arrow was loosed. But the Romans were not entirely broken. The Western Empire, though weakened, had one man capable of standing against Attila: Flavius Idius. Idius had spent his life among barbarians. As a young man, he had lived as a hostage among the Huns themselves, learning their ways, understanding their minds. He spoke their tongue, knew their tactics, and perhaps more importantly, understood their leader. If anyone in the empire could resist Attila, it was him. Yet even Idius knew Rome could not stand alone. His legions were few, his resources stretched thin. To stop Attila, he would need allies, and so he turned to the Visigoths. In the city of Toulouse, the Visigothic king Theodoric weighed Idius's plea. The Goths had long been enemies of Rome, fighting bloody battles against its legions. But Attila threatened them all. If the Huns devoured Gaul, no Gothic kingdom would survive. And so, in an alliance born of desperation, Rome and the Visigoths joined forces. It was an uneasy pact, built on mistrust. But it was the only chance to face the storm that was sweeping across Gaul. Meanwhile, Attila pressed onward. Orleans, one of Gaul's great cities, stood in his path. Its walls were strong, its people determined, but the Huns surrounded it, like wolves circling prey. Day by day, the siege tightened. Starvation crept in. The people prayed for salvation, their eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for a miracle. That miracle came in the form of dust rising on the horizon. Idius and Theodoric had arrived. Their combined army marched toward Orleans, and Attila, seeing the risk of being trapped, withdrew. But retreat was not defeat. He fell back onto the open plains, choosing ground where his horsemen could dominate, where his warriors could unleash their fury. The stage was set for one of the greatest battles of the ancient world, the Battle of the Catalonian Fields. But before that day came, the march itself had already carved Attila's name into legend. To the Romans, he was no longer just a barbarian king. He was a force of nature, a scourge, sent by the gods to punish the world. Priests whispered of divine wrath, bishops preached of apocalypse, and common people fled in terror. Convinced the end of days had arrived, to his own people, he was more than a king. He was a master of fate, chosen by the heavens to lead the Huns to glory. His warriors followed him not just for plunder, but because they believed he carried destiny in his hands. And to his enemies, the Franks, the Burgundians, he was a shadow that stretched across the land, a shadow that threatened to swallow them all. The march into Gaul was more than conquest. It was prophecy fulfilled. A world already crumbling under the weight of decline was now being tested by the most feared man of the age. The land burned. The people wept. And all of Gaul braced itself for the storm to come. The Catalonian fields awaited. Chapter 10. The Catalonian Fields, Clash of Empires. The year was 451 AD. The land of Gaul lay shattered. Cities smoldered in ruin, fields were blackened with ash, and rivers carried the echoes of screams. The Huns had come like a storm, sweeping away all in their path. But now, at last, a wall of resistance stood before them. It would not be a Roman wall of stone. It would not be a fortress or a city. Instead, it would be an Armenian alliance born of desperation, forged by necessity, and united by the single truth that if Attila was not stopped here, nothing could stand against him again. On one side stood Attila, the Scourge of God, commanding perhaps the largest army of his career. Tens of thousands of Hun horsemen, their bows strung tight, their blades gleaming. Beside them marched Gothic tribes, Syri-Rugians, Gepid's barbarian peoples drawn into his orbit, compelled by fear or the promise of plunder. It was not a single nation, but a tide of nations. A force so vast that the earth itself seemed to shake beneath their hooves. On the other side stood the desperate alliance. The Western Roman army, under the general Flavius Idius, and the Visigoths under their king, Theodoric I. Romans and Goths, once mortal enemies, now bound together by the shadow of Attila. Their numbers were smaller, their loyalties uncertain, but their resolve was absolute, for if they failed here, Gaul would be lost, and with it, the remnants of Rome. The place chosen for battle was a vast expanse of open land, the Catalonian fields. Rolling plains stretched to the horizon, broken only by low ridges and scattered villages. To Attila, this was perfect ground. Here his horsemen could sweep like waves across the field, surrounding and crushing his enemies. To Idius, it was a gamble, but it was a gamble he had to take. As the armies gathered, the air grew heavy with expectation. 4 days, both sides maneuvered, watching, probing, waiting for the moment to strike. Smoke from burning villages curled into the sky. The cries of displaced peasants echoed in the distance, and between the two camps, a silence hung like a storm waiting to break. At night, campfires lit the plains, stretching into the horizon. Each fire marked a warrior sharpening his blade, a rider feeding his horse, a priest whispering prayers into the dark. In Attila's camp, the king himself stood among his men, speaking not with the gilded words of emperors, but with the fire of destiny. He told them they were chosen by heaven, that the world itself trembled before them, that the gods of war had delivered their enemies into their hands. In the Roman camp, the mood was different. Idius walked the lines, speaking in calm, measured tones. He reminded his men that Rome had faced worse and endured. He reminded the Goths that their wives and children lay behind them, waiting for protection. He promised that if they stood together, they could halt even the Scourge of God. The morning of battle came with a red dawn, the sky painted as if by blood. Birds fled the fields, and the ground shook as tens of thousands formed their ranks. Shields locked into place, spears bristled, arrows glinted in the rising sun. Then, with a cry that seemed to split the heavens, the Huns charged. The sound was deafening. Hoofs thundered against the earth, shaking the ground like an earthquake. Their arrows darkened the sky, falling like a storm of iron. Men screamed, shields shattered, horses fell. It was war at its most brutal, most primal. But the Roman and Gothic line held. Shield to shield, spear to spear, they braced against the tide. The clash was unlike anything Gaul had ever seen. Whole ranks fell in moments, crushed beneath the fury of the charge. Yet others stepped forward, filling the gaps, refusing to yield. In the center of the field, chaos reigned. The Huns pushed forward with relentless force, their riders darting in and out, unleashing arrows before vanishing into the swirl of battle. The Goths, fighting with savage ferocity, countered with their heavy infantry, hacking down horsemen in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the cries of the dying. King Theodoric fought at the front of his people, his sword flashing in the sunlight, his voice carrying above the roar of battle. But destiny is cruel. In the melee, he was struck down, trampled beneath the chaos of men and horses. The news spread like wildfire among the Visigoths. Their king was dead. For a moment, despair threatened to shatter them. But then, something remarkable happened. The Visigoths did not break. Instead, they fought with renewed fury, as if avenging their fallen king. His son Thorismund rallied them, shouting that the only way to honor Theodoric was to fight until victory. Meanwhile, Attila watched from the safety of his wooden-wheeled war carriage, surrounded by his guards. He had unleashed his fury, but the Roman Gothic line refused to crumble. The more his men pushed, the harder the resistance became. The plains that should have favored his cavalry became a slaughterhouse, where every charge was met with iron walls of shields and spears. By late afternoon, the battlefield was a sea of corpses. Men and horses lay tangled in heaps, blood soaking the soil. The air was thick with the stench of death. And still, the fighting raged. Neither side yielded. Neither side could claim victory. As the sun began to set, Attila made a choice. He ordered his men to withdraw not in panic, but in grim calculation. He pulled his warriors back into their camp, piling wagons into a makeshift fortress. From there, he dared his enemies to attack, but Idius did not take the bait. He knew the danger of storming a fortified camp, especially against warriors as fierce as the Huns. Instead, he held his ground, allowing Attila to stew in frustration. The battle was over, but not decided. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides licked their wounds. But one truth was clear. The Huns had been stopped. For the first time, Attila's advance had been checked. The storm had met resistance, and though the Catalonian fields were soaked in blood, Rome and her allies still stood. Yet even in defeat, Attila remained dangerous. His army was battered, but not broken. His will was shaken, but not shattered. He would retreat, yes, but he would not disappear. He would return, fiercer than ever. And so the world held its breath. The Scourge of God had been slowed, but not destroyed. The question remained, where would he strike next? The answer would terrify Rome itself. Chapter 11. The Turning Tide, Defeat, and Retreat. The year 451 had ended with a field of corpses, a scar upon the plains of Gaul that would be remembered for centuries. The Catalonian fields were soaked with blood, Roman, Gothic, and Hun alike. It was a battle with no clear victor, a clash so violent that even the survivors carried with them the silence of the dead. Yet from the ruins of that carnage, one truth had become undeniable. Attila the Hun, the Scourge of God, had been stopped. For the first time in his reign of terror, Attila had not swept his enemies aside like dry reeds before a flood. Instead, he had been forced to withdraw, his fury blunted, his momentum checked. The fields where he had expected to crush Rome had instead swallowed his strength in a storm of iron and fire. And though he lived to fight again, the myth of his invincibility had been shaken. But history rarely gives men like Attila only one chance. Even in retreat, he remained a shadow over the world, a figure whose very presence unsettled empires. The Romans knew this, the Goths knew this, and most of all, Attila himself knew this, as his army limped back from Gaul, dragging wagons filled with plunder, wounded warriors, and the memories of the fallen. Attila burned with rage. He had been denied victory, denied glory, denied the chance to write his name in Roman blood. Yet he was not broken. His spirit was as fierce as ever, and he was already planning his next move. In the Roman camp, the mood was one of cautious triumph. Flavius Itius, the general who had orchestrated the alliance against Attila, was hailed as the savior of Gaul. He had done what no one else had managed. He had stood against the Huns and survived. But Itius was no fool. He knew Attila too well. He knew this retreat was not an ending, but a pause. He told his allies, "Do not believe he is finished. Attila withdraws, but he does not surrender. He will return, and return he would." As the winter of 451 gave way to spring, the Roman world waited in dread. Villages rebuilt their walls. Cities strengthened their gates. Priests prayed in hushed tones. And all the while, rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed Attila was gathering new armies from the distant steppes. Others whispered that he was forging alliances with tribes even more savage than the Huns. Still others swore they had seen him in dreams, a figure cloaked in fire, promising to return. In truth, Attila was gathering his strength. His army, though bloodied, remained vast. His treasury, swollen with tribute and plunder, gave him the means to rebuild. His will was as relentless as ever. And now, his eyes turned south, not to Gaul, but to Italy itself, the very heart of Rome. The news struck terror across the empire. The Eternal City had not faced such a threat since the days of Hannibal. Rome, once the mistress of the world, was now fragile, her armies stretched thin, her coffers strained, her spirit weary. If Attila descended upon Italy, who could stop him? But before his march began, the consequences of Catalonian fields rippled outward. Among the Visigoths, the death of King Theodoric had created unrest. His son, Thorismund, struggled to secure his throne, wary of Roman influence and Gothic factions. Itius, the Roman general, found himself playing politics as much as war, trying to hold together the fragile alliances that had won the day. And everywhere, the people of Gaul whispered of Attila's shadow, fearful that he would strike again at any moment. Yet in the midst of fear, something had changed. The aura of Attila, the sense that he was unstoppable, had been pierced. His enemies had seen him retreat. They had seen him hesitate, and in that hesitation, they found courage. Still, courage would not be enough when he came again. The spring of 452 dawned with fire. Attila crossed the Alps, bringing his army into the fertile plains of northern Italy. Cities burned before him: Aquila, Padua, Verona. His horsemen swept across the land, their arrows blotting out the sun, their cries striking terror in every heart. Refugees poured south toward Rome, carrying tales of horror, of entire towns wiped from the earth. But this time, something was different. The Huns were no longer invincible shadows. They were flesh and blood, and the scars of Catalonian fields still marked them. Their numbers were smaller, their spirit not as fierce, and though they brought terror, they no longer seemed divine. Even Attila himself felt the weight of that defeat. He had once been certain of victory, certain of destiny, but at Catalonian fields, he had seen destiny turn its face away. The memory gnawed at him, fueling his anger, but also planting seeds of doubt. As his army marched through Italy, the Romans prepared for the worst. Yet fate had a twist in store. In the summer of 452, outside the walls of Rome, Attila was met not by an army, but by a delegation led by Pope Leo I. What passed between them remains one of history's mysteries. Some said the Pope promised tribute. Others said he threatened Attila with divine wrath. Still others claimed that Attila saw a vision, an angel with a flaming sword, warning him to spare the city. Whatever the truth, Attila turned back. Rome was spared. The Scourge of God retreated once more. The turning tide had begun. Chapter 12. Rome trembles. The meeting with Pope Leo. The year was 452. The land of Italy burned. Cities that had once flourished with markets, temples, and laughter now lay in ruins. Aquila, a proud city of the north, had been wiped from the earth. Verona had fallen. Padua was a smoldering husk. The plains of northern Italy, Once the breadbasket of Rome, were now scarred by fire and the hoofprints of Attila's army. The Huns had come, and behind them, they left only silence and ash. But one city still stood untouched, Rome, the eternal city. The heart of an empire that had ruled the known world, now trembled at the thought of Attila's arrival. Rome had survived Visigoths and Vandals. It had endured civil wars and invasions, yet never had it faced an enemy so feared, so relentless, so wrapped in legend. To its citizens, Attila was not just a man, he was an omen. They called him the Scourge of God, a punishment sent to remind Rome of its sins. Within the city walls, panic spread. The Senate debated frantically. Some argued for resistance, others demanded surrender. Merchants hoarded their wealth. Families prayed to their gods. Rumors swirled through the streets. Attila was coming with an army so vast it blotted out the horizon. He would tear down the walls, stone by stone, enslave the people, and salt the earth where Rome once stood. And then, a decision was made, one as strange as it was desperate. Rome would not send an army against Attila. It would not resist him with swords and shields. Instead, it would send a man, a single man, armed not with steel, but with faith. That man was Pope Leo I. Leo was no warrior. He carried no blade, commanded no battalions. Yet he possessed something else, a presence, a force of spirit, a conviction that made emperors listen and kings tremble. His voice was calm, but it carried authority. His faith was unwavering, and his reputation stretched across the empire. If anyone could face Attila, it was Leo. And so, in the heat of summer, Pope Leo set out from Rome. He was accompanied by a small delegations, senators, priests, envoys. Together, they rode north, their path marked by the smoke of burning towns, their ears filled with the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Each mile brought them closer to the shadow of death. Yet Leo did not falter. When they finally reached the Hunnic camp, they beheld a sight that would haunt them forever. The fields were black with tents and wagons, stretching as far as the eye could see. Fires burned day and night. Warriors moved like restless spirits, sharpening blades, tending horses, singing songs of war. At the center of it all stood Attila's command, his great wagon, flanked by guards, crowned with banners, and surrounded by the treasures of conquest. And there, in the heart of this barbarian empire, Pope Leo met the Scourge of God. No Roman scribe recorded the exact words of their exchange. Historians can only guess. Some say Leo promised tribute gold, land, and concessions. Others claim he spoke of Rome's sanctity, of its role as the city of St. Peter, of divine punishment that would fall upon anyone who dared to sack it. Still others whisper of visions that Attila saw something no mortal could ignore. They say that as Leo spoke, Attila looked up and saw a figure beside the Pope, a towering angel, sword drawn, eyes blazing with holy fire. Some swore it was the Apostle Peter himself, warning the Hun king that to touch Rome was to invite heaven's wrath. Whatever the truth, something happened in that moment. For the first time in his life, Attila yielded. The man who had razed cities, broken empires, and slaughtered thousands now agreed to turn back. The man who had been called unstoppable now stopped. He ordered his warriors to withdraw from Italy. Rome was spared. To the Romans, it was nothing short of a miracle. In churches across the empire, bells rang. Priests declared that God himself had intervened to save the eternal city. To the people, Pope Leo became more than a man. He became the shepherd who had faced the wolf and lived. But historians, even centuries later, debated the truth. Why did Attila turn back? Was it truly faith, or was it something else? Some pointed to practical reasons. His army, battered since the Catalonian fields, was weakened by hunger and disease. Northern Italy, stripped of crops, could no longer feed his vast horde. Plague spread through the camps, felling warriors faster than Roman swords ever could. Others believed he feared the arrival of the Eastern Roman army, which was moving west to support Italy. Perhaps Attila had simply decided the risk was too great. But the mystery remained. For Attila, the retreat was not surrender. It was strategy. He returned to his lands beyond the Danube, carrying with him not only the plunder of Italy, but also a legend that had grown even darker. He was no longer just a destroyer. He was the man who had stood before the Pope, who had been touched by the hand of fate. His name spread further, becoming half-man, half-myth, and yet, this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter. Rome had been spared, but Attila's shadow still loomed. His enemies knew he would strike again, perhaps with more fury than ever before. His allies whispered of his restlessness, his hunger for dominance, his inability to accept defeat. The meeting with Leo had not ended his story, it had only deepened it, for soon, Attila would face not a city, not an army, but his own destiny, and destiny would prove far more ruthless than Rome. Chapter 13. A King of Contradictions. Attila's Court. When most of Rome imagined Attila the Hun, they pictured a monster, a savage horseman, face twisted in fury, his sword dripping with Roman blood. To them, he was no man at all, but a shadow, a beast sent by God to punish their sins. Yet within the heart of Attila's world, the truth was far more complex. Attila was no simple barbarian. He was a ruler, a strategist, a king who commanded one of the most diverse and dangerous coalitions of tribes the world had ever seen. His court was not chaos, it was order, an order forged in fear, ambition, and loyalty, and at its center was Attila himself, a man of contradictions. Accounts from Roman envoys give us rare glimpses into his world. One such account comes from Priscus of Panium, a Roman diplomat who visited Attila's court in the 440s. What he saw defied the rumors. The Hunnic capital was no marble city like Rome or Constantinople. It was a vast settlement of wooden halls, sprawling camps, and endless horses grazing on the open plains. There were no walls, for the Huns feared no siege. Their strength was not in stone, but in mobility, in the endless freedom of the steppe. Yet at the heart of this settlement stood Attila's hall-long wooden structure, richly decorated not with gold, but with discipline and austerity. When Priscus entered this hall, he was struck by what he saw. Around Attila sat nobles, warriors, and envoys from every corner of the known world. Ostrogoths, Gepids, Syri, Rugians, all tribes, who owed him allegiance, mingled with ambassadors from Rome and Constantinople. The atmosphere was tense, yet strangely ordered. Every man knew his place. Every voice waited for permission to speak. And then there was Attila himself. He did not sit on a golden throne. He did not wear a crown of jewels. Instead, he sat upon a simple wooden stool, dressed in plain clothes, his cup made of wood, while his guests drank from goblets of silver and gold. His face was unremarkable, his stature neither towering nor small, but his presence was overwhelming. Every eye turned toward him, every breath seemed to wait for his command. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words cut through the hall like a blade. Here was the paradox of Attila, a man who commanded unimaginable wealth, yet lived in simplicity. A king who could have drowned himself in luxury, yet chose austerity. A warlord who could unleash unimaginable violence, yet valued order, discipline, and loyalty above all. But make no mistake, this simplicity was not humility. It was power. By refusing excess, Attila set himself apart from every other king and chieftain. He reminded his followers that he was not like them, not like the Romans. He was chosen, marked by destiny. His greatness lay not in gold, but in the fear and loyalty he commanded, and his court reflected that fear. Behind the calm order, there was always the threat of violence. Tribes that defied him were crushed without mercy. Leaders who betrayed him were executed, their bodies left as warnings. Even among his allies, loyalty was never guaranteed, was demanded. Attila ruled not by love, but by terror, by the knowledge that disobedience would mean ruin. Yet at the same time, he inspired loyalty beyond fear. Many of the tribes who served him did so not because they were forced, but because under Attila, they found unity. The Huns gave them victories, land, plunder, and the chance to strike against Rome, their ancient enemy. To these warriors, Attila was not a tyrant. He was the leader they had always longed for. Priscus describes one feast at Attila's court. The tables were laden with meat, bread, and wine. Nobles feasted on golden plates, their laughter filling the hall. Musicians played, dancers entertained. But Attila himself sat quietly, eating sparingly, drinking little, observing everything. He was not a man lost in revelry. He was a man always in control, always calculating, always watching. And in that silence, his power grew. But even kings are men, and Attila's personal life was as complex as his rule. He had many wives, as was the custom of the Huns, each one a symbol of alliance with a different tribe. Marriage was not love but politics, a way to bind powerful families to his will. Yet his household, though vast, was not a place of peace. Rivalries simmered, jealousies burned, and Attila's children grew up in a world where power was inherited not by blood alone, but by strength and cunning. For all his contradictions, Attila remained consistent in one thing, his sense of destiny. He believed himself chosen by the gods, destined to rule not just the steppes, but the world. Every victory was proof of this, every defeat a test of his resolve. To his followers, he was more than a man, he was a force, a living storm, a being touched by the divine. And yet, his humanity showed in quiet ways. He valued loyalty. He rewarded bravery. He respected those who faced him without fear. Even Roman envoys who despised him admitted that Attila possessed a strange charisma, a magnetism that drew men to him despite themselves. He could terrify, but he could also inspire. It was this paradox that made him so dangerous. He was not the monster of Roman nightmares, nor the barbarian of Gothic tales. He was something far more complex, a king who understood both fear and restraint, violence and order. A man who could burn cities to the ground, yet sit upon a wooden stool and drink from a wooden cup. As the 450s drew to a close, Attila's court became the center of the barbarian world. Tribes came to pledge loyalty, envoys came to bargain, spies came to whisper. And through it all, Attila sat at the center, weaving together an empire not of stone, but of blood and allegiance. But contradictions are fragile things. They hold for a time, and then they break. Attila's court, for all its order and power, was not immune to the tensions of ambition and betrayal. His allies grew restless. His enemies plotted. His own family simmered with rivalries, and as his legend grew, so too did the weight of destiny pressing down upon him. For the Scourge of God could not remain in balance forever. His simplicity, his brutality, his vision all would soon collide with the reality of mortality, and when that collision came, it would shake the world. Chapter 14. The Barbarian Empire, Unity Through Fear. The story of Attila the Hun is not only the story of a man, it is the story of an empire, unlike Rome, unlike Persia, unlike any that had come before. It was not carved from marble, it was not written in laws, it was not secured by walls or temples. It was bound together by something far more primal, fear. By the middle of the 5th century, Attila ruled over one of the most extraordinary coalitions the world had ever seen. At its core were the Huns, his own people, masters of the horse and bow. Around them swirled a storm of tribes: Ostrogoths, Gepids, Rugians, Alans, Siri, Heruli, and countless others. Some had bent the knee willingly, seeking protection or plunder. Others had been forced into submission, their leaders executed, their warriors folded into Attila's war machine. Together, they formed a realm that stretched from the edges of the Rhine to the distant steppes of Central Asia. It was not a kingdom in the Roman sense. There were no provinces, no governors, no marble capitals where decrees were carved into stone. It was a living, breathing empire of horsemen in camps, of shifting allegiances and constant movement. Its capital, if it had one, was Attila himself, wherever he rode. There lay the center of power, and yet, for all its fluidity, this empire worked. It moved like a single beast, snarling, striking, and consuming everything in its path. But it did so only because of Attila. His will was the spine of this empire. His fury was the glue that held it together. His charisma, his discipline, his terrifying aura, these were the laws that bound men who otherwise would have torn each other apart. But fear was the sharpest of these laws. Attila ruled through it with precision. He punished betrayal swiftly, brutally, and publicly. Chieftains who defied him were executed in front of their people. Whole villages that resisted were erased from the map. Even within his court, the reminder was constant. Loyalty was life. Disobedience was death. And yet fear was only half of the equation. Attila also rewarded loyalty. Warriors who fought well were given spoils, land, and prestige. Leaders who proved faithful were raised higher, their families tied to Attila through marriage or oath. In this way, his empire was not only one of terror, but of opportunity. To many, Attila was both the destroyer and the giver. Under his banner, they could win more than they ever had under Rome. To understand the scale of this empire, one must imagine its diversity. Around Attila's campfires, dozens of languages mingled. Gothic warriors and heavy mail stood beside Hun horsemen in leather and fur. Rugian chieftains with long beards feasted beside Alans with braided hair. Some were Christians, whispering prayers in the night. Others still clung to the gods of the steppe spirits of the sky, the sun, the ancestors. And yet, all bent their knee to one man. This was Attila's genius. He had forged unity where there had been only division. For centuries, Rome had fought to keep the barbarians fractured, to set tribe against tribe, to keep them weak and manageable. Attila shattered that balance. He took the scattered pieces and bound them together in one fist, and, with that fist, he struck at Rome itself. But such unity was fragile. Beneath the surface, rivalries burned. The Goths resented Hun dominance. The Gepids whispered of freedom. Even among the Huns, jealousy stirred. Everyone feared Attila, but not everyone loved him. And so long as he lived, the beast obeyed. But what would happen when he was gone? For now, though, Attila's empire grew. His raids into the Roman world brought unimaginable wealth. Gold poured into his camp, tribute from Constantinople, bribes from the Western Empire, plunder from burned cities. This wealth did not sit idle. It fed his warriors, bought their loyalty, strengthened his hand. Rome had thought to buy peace, but in truth, it had bought the chains of its own torment. The Romans themselves struggled to comprehend this new order. To them, empire meant cities, laws, and order. They could not imagine an empire without marble, without statues, without scrolls. And yet, Attila's empire was real, and it was deadly. Rome feared it not because it understood it, but because it could not. Even Roman envoys, when they visited Attila's court, spoke of the strange mixture of savagery and discipline. They saw warriors feasting like wolves, but obeying Attila like soldiers. They saw a world where wealth was flaunted by nobles, yet the king himself lived simply, eating from a wooden plate. They saw chaos, yet behind it, they sensed the cold, calculating will of a ruler who knew exactly what he was doing. But fear has limits. It binds men tightly, but only so long as the hand of power is unshakable. And cracks, small though they were, began to appear. Tribes that had once submitted quietly now began to whisper. Leaders who had pledged loyalty now plotted in secret. Even within Attila's family, ambitions stirred. His sons grew restless, eager for power, uncertain of their father's iron grip. Yet, Attila remained undeterred. To his enemies, he seemed unstoppable. Even after his setback at the Catalonian fields, he returned stronger, his army still vast, his influence still expanding. He was like a storm that could be delayed, but never defeated. But storms cannot last forever. In building an empire of fear, Attila had created something both powerful and fragile. It was a kingdom that existed only so long as he did. It had no foundation in stone, no laws to outlive him, no capital to endure beyond his reign. It was held together by one man's will, and by one man's will alone. And deep within Attila himself, contradictions grew sharper. He was the destroyer who built unity, the barbarian who valued discipline, the king who lived simply, yet commanded unimaginable wealth, the warlord who believed he was chosen by destiny yet who knew, in his heart, that even destiny cannot shield a man from mortality. The barbarian empire was at its height. It had humbled Rome, terrified Constantinople, and brought the ancient world to its knees. But like all empires, it carried within itself the seeds of its own end, and soon those seeds would take root. Chapter 15. The Threat to Italy. The year was 452. Across the fields and forests of northern Italy, a shadow moved vast, unstoppable, and hungry. It was not merely an army. It was a tide of destruction, rolling southward, devouring villages, burning cities, leaving only ashes and terror behind. At its head rode a man who had become more than a king, more than a warlord. To some, he was the Scourge of God. To others, the herald of the world's end. His name was Attila. For decades, Rome had lived in fear of him. His horsemen had thundered across the Danube, shattered cities in Gaul, and forced emperors to kneel with gold in trembling hands. But now, Attila's gaze turned to Italy itself, the beating heart of the Western Roman Empire. Rome, the eternal city, was no longer a distant name in his ambitions. It was his prize, his target, the jewel he meant to claim. The march into Italy began with fury. Aquileia, the great city of the northeast, stood in his path. For generations, it had resisted invaders, its walls strong, its citizens proud. But Attila had no patience for delay. His armies surrounded the city, choking it into desperation. And then, with fire and iron, he broke it. Ancient writers tell us that Aquileia burned so brightly that its flames were seen for miles across the plains. Its walls crumbled, its people slaughtered or enslaved. The survivors scattered, some fleeing into the marshes, where they built huts on stilts above the waters. In time, these desperate refugees would give birth to a new city. But in 452, there was no Venice, only ruin and smoke. Aquileia had been wiped from the earth, and its ashes marked the beginning of Attila's Italian campaign. From there, the destruction spread. Verona, Vicenza, and Padua fell in turn. Each city that resisted was punished. Those that surrendered were spared for a price. Gold flowed into Attila's hands, while fear spread deeper and deeper into the peninsula. The once proud Roman roads, paved and enduring, now carried the thunder of Hun hooves. The fertile plains of the Po Valley, long the breadbasket of Rome, were trampled into wasteland. The Western Roman Empire, already crumbling, was powerless to stop him. Its armies were weak, its coffers empty, its generals divided. The emperor, Valentinian III, sat trembling in Ravenna, his capital, by the sea, watching helplessly as the terror crept ever closer. But the people, ordinary Romans, felt the horror most of all. Imagine the fear of a farmer in northern Italy, hearing the distant thunder of hooves. Imagine the terror of a mother clutching her child as smoke rose from the horizon. Imagine the silence that followed, when everything she knew, her village, her home, her family, was gone. To these people, Attila was not a man, he was an apocalypse. And yet, for all his fury, there was strategy in Attila's march. He knew Rome was weak, but he also knew it was dangerous to stretch too far. Famine, disease, and exhaustion haunted his army as it pushed south. Italy was rich, yes, but it was also plagued by hunger. The land could not easily feed the endless hordes that followed him. Attila had to move carefully. Still, his advance seemed unstoppable. By midsummer, his forces threatened the very gates of Rome, the eternal city. The heart of an empire that had once ruled the world, now quaked under the shadow of the Scourge of God. But then, something extraordinary happened. As Attila prepared to strike at Rome, a delegation came to meet him. At its head was not a general, not an emperor, but a man in white robes, Pope Leo. I thought it is one of the most dramatic encounters in history. On one side, Attila, conqueror of cities, ruler of nations, feared by millions. On the other, a Christian bishop, armed not with swords or armies, but with faith and words. They met near the river Mincio, somewhere north of Rome. What was said between them, no one knows for certain. The records are shrouded in legend. Some claim that Leo promised tribute and peace if Attila would spare the city. Others whispered that he threatened Attila with visions of divine wrath, that he told him Rome was under the protection of the saints Peter and Paul, and that to strike it would be to invite the fury of heaven. Ancient chroniclers add a darker layer. They say Attila, as he listened to Leo, saw two towering figures standing behind the Pope, armed and glowing with fire. Saints or visions, angels or illusions, whatever they were, the Hun turned back. The fact remains, Attila withdrew. He spared Rome. The reasons remain a mystery. Perhaps Leo's word shook him. Perhaps his army, weakened by famine and disease, could no longer risk a siege. Perhaps Attila had already won what he wanted: tribute, fear, and the humiliation of the empire. Or perhaps, in the depths of his heart, even the Scourge of God knew there were some limits he dared not cross. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The city of Rome, once again, escaped destruction not by force of arms, but by a single meeting between two men. For the Romans, it was nothing less than a miracle. The Pope had saved the eternal city. For Attila, it was a pause, not a defeat. He returned to his camp, his army still vast, his ambitions still burning. But something had changed. His empire was at its height, yet cracks had begun to widen. His warriors were weary. His enemies were learning. His allies whispered in the shadows. And though Rome had been spared, the fear of Attila still hung heavy in the air. Italy had seen the face of the storm, and though it had passed, the skies were still dark. The world knew Attila was not finished, and soon his legend would take an even darker turn. Chapter 16. The Dark Legend Grows. By 452, Attila was more than a king, more than a conqueror. He was a legend, alive and walking, cloaked not just in armor, but in the whispers of men who feared him. His name had become a curse, spoken in hushed tones from the Black Sea to the walls of Rome. Mothers frightened their children into silence with it. Priests preached of him as if he were a punishment sent from God himself. To the Romans, to the Goths, to the world, Attila was no longer merely a man. He was terror made flesh. The seeds of this legend had been planted long before. His campaigns across Gaul and Italy, the sacking of Aquileia, the tribute exacted from Constantinople, all had shown his might. But legend grows not from deeds alone. It grows from stories, and in the case of Attila, those stories spread like wildfire, carried by refugees, envoys, merchants, and soldiers who had seen him more claimed to. What was Attila really like? Ancient writers give us conflicting images. Some described him as short, broad-chested, with a flat nose and piercing eyes. He was not handsome in the Roman sense, but there was something unforgettable about him, something that struck fear into those who met his gaze. He was said to be plain in his dress, preferring simple clothes over jewels, wooden cups over gold chalices, meat and bread over banquets of luxury. And yet, around him glittered the wealth of nations, the tribute of emperors, the spoils of plunder. His restraint only made him more formidable. To his followers, this simplicity was strength. Attila was not a king softened by riches. He was still one of them, a warrior, a rider, a man hardened by the same winds and hardships of the steppe. To his enemies, however, his simplicity seemed alien, almost monstrous. How could a man who commanded such wealth live as if he cared nothing for it? Did it mean he was above temptation, or that he sought something more sinister than gold? This tension fed the legend, and soon Attila became more than flesh and blood. Rumors swirled that he was protected by the gods of war, chosen to bring ruin to Rome. Some whispered that he had in his possession the sword of Mars, a weapon of divine power that guaranteed victory in battle. When he triumphed, they said it was because the heavens themselves willed it. When cities fell, they said it was fate, not strategy. And when he spared Rome after meeting Pope Leo, many believed it was because he had seen angels barring his way. Attila the man was a skilled commander, a shrewd politician, and a ruthless leader. But Attila, the legend, was something far greater and far darker. He was destiny. He was doomed. The spread of Christianity added another layer to his myth. For the early church, Attila became a symbol of divine punishment. They called him the Scourge of God, a rod of wrath sent to chastise a sinful world. Priests thundered from their pulpits that his invasions were not merely wars, but warnings. Rome had grown corrupt, they said. Its people had turned from God, and so God had sent Attila, scourging the earth with fire and blood to bring repentance. This image stuck. Even centuries later, long after his empire had vanished, Attila's name would still be invoked as a judgment from on high. Whenever disaster struck, whenever enemies seemed unstoppable, men would mutter, "It is like Attila has come again." But the legend was not only one of fear. In the steppes and among his own people, stories painted Attila differently. To the Huns, he was not a scourge but a unifier, a father, a protector. He had forged tribes into a nation, given them victories, wealth, and pride. Songs told of his cunning, his generosity to his followers, his ability to command loyalty from so many. For them, the darkness of his legend in Roman eyes was proof of his greatness. Was it not fitting, they thought, that their king should terrify the mightiest empire the world had ever known? Legends often reveal more about those who tell them than about the man himself. The Romans needed Attila to be a monster, because only a monster could explain why their empire trembled. The Huns needed him to be a hero because only a hero could justify their loyalty and sacrifice. In truth, he was both, and neither. He was simply Attila, ruthless and ambitious, shaped by the steppe and sharpened by war. But as the years wore on, even Attila began to feel the weight of his legend. He had become larger than life, but life is finite. He was no longer a young rider, chasing glory on the plains. He was a ruler, a commander of multitudes, burdened with enemies and traitors. His empire stretched wide, but it was brittle, its tribes bound by fear more than love. He knew that his death would be its greatest test. The whispers of mortality surrounded him. His enemies whispered of poison, of assassins, of plots to undo him. His allies whispered of succession, of who would take his place when he was gone. His sons watched him closely, eager, impatient, hungry for power. But Attila himself showed no fear. If he thought of death, he gave no sign. To his followers, he remained the immovable mountain, the unstoppable storm. His legend demanded nothing less, and yet, every legend must meet its end. In the year 453, as the shadow of his empire loomed over both east and west, Attila prepared for a new chapter in his life, a marriage that would change everything. The bride was young, a noblewoman named Ildiko. To his enemies, it seemed a strange moment of softness, a distraction from war. To his allies, it was another act of power, binding more tribes to his cause. But in truth, it would be the night that turned Attila's legend into myth, because within that marriage feast, within the laughter and wine, within the celebration of power and triumph, waited his end. The man who had been called the Scourge of God would die not on the battlefield, not beneath a storm of arrows, not in a blaze of glory, but in the silence of his own bedchamber. And with that death, his legend would grow darker still. Chapter 17. Marriage and Mystery. Attila's Final Night. The year was 453. Attila, the Scourge of God, ruler of a vast empire stretching from the steppes of Central Asia to the heart of Europe, had survived decades of war, conquest, and fear. He had crushed armies, razed cities, demanded tribute from emperors, and become a living legend. Yet even the greatest empires, even the most feared men, are mortal. Attila's final chapter begins not on a battlefield, but in celebration. The Hun king had taken a young bride, Ildiko, a noblewoman whose family connections would strengthen his alliances. To his warriors, it was a political triumph, another step in consolidating power. To the world, it seemed like a rare moment of personal life in a man defined by war. The wedding was a grand affair by Hun standards. Feasting, wine, and celebration filled the air. Nobles from every corner of his empire gathered, their loyalty solidified by shared spoils, their fear heightened by the presence of the unstoppable king. Attila, ever austere, even in triumph, dined simply, observing his guests with piercing eyes. Around him, the revelry roared. The music, the laughter, the clinking of cupsel seemed distant from the mind of a man whose thoughts were as sharp and calculating as his sword. But that night, the Scourge of God met his end not at the hands of an enemy army, not in battle, but in the quiet of his own tent. Ancient sources give conflicting accounts, and centuries of legend have clouded the truth. Some say he died in his sleep, choked by a sudden nosebleed, a condition that may have been worsened by heavy drinking. Others whisper of poison, of betrayal by someone close, perhaps even by his new wife, though there is no solid evidence. The only certainty is this: Attila the Hun, the terror of emperors, the breaker of cities, the man who seemed invincible, was dead. The death of Attila sent shockwaves through the empire. His court, once unified by fear, began to fracture immediately. Without his commanding presence, the Huns, the Ostrogoths, the Gepids, and other allied tribes struggled to maintain loyalty. What had been held together by terror was now unraveling. Generals argued, nobles plotted, and sons looked to claim power. The unity that had allowed Attila to dominate Europe evaporated almost overnight. In Rome and Constantinople, the news of Attila's death was met with astonishment and relief. The Scourge of God, the man who had brought emperors to their knees and left armies trembling, was gone. Emperors breathed easier, cities rebuilt, and for a moment, the shadow that had loomed over the known world lifted. Yet even in death, Attila's legend persisted. Stories of his invincibility, his ruthlessness, and his empire spread farther than his body ever traveled. Romans still whispered his name in fear. The peoples of the steppes remembered him as a unifier and a king who commanded loyalty and respect. His death became the seed for myths, tales told to frighten children, to warn armies, and to inspire leaders. Attila's personal life, shrouded in mystery, became part of that legend. Who was Ildiko? Did she play a role in his death? Was it fate, divine will, or simply the fragility of life that claimed him? These questions would echo through history, unanswered, fueling stories of betrayal, divine punishment, and the sudden collapse of one of the most feared men the world had ever known. After his death, his empire did not last. Within a few years, the coalition of tribes that he had held together by fear and respect splintered. Civil wars erupted, territories were lost, and the once unstoppable Huns faded from the power centers of Europe. The shadow of Attila remained, but the storm itself had passed, and yet his impact endured. Europe, scarred by his campaigns, rebuilt, but never forgot. The fear he inspired became legend. The territories he had conquered would shape future kingdoms. The stories of his brutality, his cunning, and his empire would be told for centuries, cementing Attila as both a historical figure and a symbol of unstoppable power. The final night of Attila's life marked not only the end of a man, but the turning point for an empire. The man who had commanded fear across continents, who had seemed invincible, who had become the embodiment of doom, was gone, but the echoes of his life, his campaigns, and his legend would resonate for generations, reminding all that history is often shaped as much by fear as by sword and shield. Attila the Hun had lived, as few men ever could, feared, revered, unstoppable in his time. But even the storm has its end, and with that end, the world began to remember him not just as a man, but as a myth. Chapter 18. The Legacy of the Huns. After the Scourge. The night Attila the Hun died in 453, the world did not stop trembling, but it began to change. His empire, built on fear, loyalty, and relentless conquest, was suddenly without its anchor. The vast coalition of Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, and other tribes, once united under the iron will of their king, began to fracture almost immediately. Power, it seemed, was not something that could survive without Attila. His sons Ilok, Dengizik, and Ernok each sought control, but none had the charisma, ruthlessness, or strategy to hold the empire together. Tribes that had obeyed out of fear now whispered, plotted, and rebelled. Within a few short years, the great Hunnic Empire that had stretched from the steppes to the borders of Rome collapsed into chaos. The eastern frontier was first to fracture. The Huns had long relied on alliances with local tribes, yet without Attila's authority, loyalty evaporated. Some tribes fled back to their homelands, reclaiming lands they had abandoned decades earlier. Others, previously subjugated, seized the moment to strike, exacting revenge for old atrocities. The once mighty horsemen of the steppes found themselves divided, scattered, and vulnerable. Meanwhile, in the west, the shadow of Rome began to lift. The city that had lived in fear for decades now breathed freely. The rivers, forests, and plains that Attila had trampled began to recover. Survivors rebuilt cities, restored farmland, and reclaimed territory. Yet the fear of Attila's memory remained, etched into the minds of all who had witnessed his campaigns. Even as the Hunnic Empire fell apart, its cultural impact endured. The sheer scale of Attila's conquests reshaped the political map of Europe. Tribal movements, caused by displacement from his campaigns, led to new alliances, conflicts, and migrations that would influence the continent for generations. The Germanic kingdoms, pressured and pushed by Hunnic expansion, began to solidify in ways that would eventually challenge Rome itself. In a sense, Attila's destruction planted the seeds for the very nations that would rise from the ashes of the Roman Empire. But the legacy of fear was perhaps Attila's greatest inheritance. To the Romans, he remained the Scourge of God, a symbol of divine wrath and human terror. Chronicles, letters, and sermons spread tales of his ferocity, of cities burned, rivers turned red with blood, and armies shattered. In monasteries, scribes recorded the story of the man who could not be stopped, ensuring that the legend would outlive the reality. Even among the Huns, Attila's shadow endured. His sons may have failed, his empire may have crumbled, but the image of their father, the man who had conquered the known world with his horsemen and bow remained a point of reference, a measure of greatness. Leaders would compare themselves to Attila. Warriors would train to match his speed and cruelty, and storytellers would recount his life as a template of fear and power. Yet, Attila's legacy was not only about destruction. His ability to unite a vast and diverse group of tribes under a single purpose was unprecedented. He showed that loyalty could be forged through fear, respect, and shared ambition. The organizational structures he created, though fragile, were sophisticated. Camps divided into units, leaders rewarded for loyalty, warriors disciplined to obey orders instantly. The Huns were more than raiders, they were an army of extraordinary efficiency, a force that could outmaneuver even the disciplined legions of Rome. Even in death, Attila influenced Rome's strategy. The Western Roman Empire, already weakened by decades of internal turmoil, had been forced to negotiate with a power that Rome could not defeat. Tribute payments, political marriages, and concessions became tools of diplomacy. Rome learned a bitter lesson, that even the mightiest empire could be brought low by a single, relentless force, and that fear itself could be wielded as power beyond Europe. The echoes of Attila's campaigns reached far and wide. Eastern empires, tribal confederations, and distant kingdoms took note of the sudden rise and fall of a man who seemed unstoppable. His story became a cautionary tale. Power, no matter how absolute, is fleeting. Empires built on terror may rise fast, but without sustainable structures, they fall even faster. Yet the legend of Attila grew larger with time. By the Middle Ages, stories of his ferocity became mythic. He was transformed into a symbol of ultimate destruction, a figure that could inspire fear in generations who would never see a Hunnic horseman in their lifetime. Poets and chroniclers described him with terrifying imagery: blood-red banners, armies like rivers, eyes that burned with the fury of heaven. To them, Attila was both human and monster. A king of the world who could crush nations as easily as a child crushes a toy. And perhaps that is Attila's truest legacy, the way he blurred the line between history and myth. He was a man who shaped a real world with fire, sword, and strategy. Yet his story became something more, something timeless, something larger than life. He taught the world that fear could be a weapon, that reputation could outweigh armies, and that even the mightiest of empires could tremble in the shadow of one determined leader. In the years that followed, the lands he had touched began to heal, yet the psychological scars remained. Rome would rebuild, kingdoms would rise, and Europe would eventually move into the Middle Ages. But the name Attila continued to echo through history as a warning and a legend. Parents whispered it to frighten children. Generals invoked it to inspire troops. Historians debated it, writers dramatized it, and storytellers carried it across centuries. The man was gone, but the legend endured. The empire he built on fear collapsed. His sons failed to hold it together, yet the mark he left on Europe could never be erased. His campaigns had shifted the balance of power, reshaped nations, and changed the course of history. Attila had been the Scourge of God, a living terror, a king of contradictions. He had united tribes through fear and charisma, destroyed cities with lightning speed, and challenged the might of Rome itself. His death ended the reign of terror, but it did not end his story. For in history, some names refuse to die. Some shadows linger long after the sun has set. Attila the Hun was one of those names. And though he was gone, his empire a memory, the world would forever remember the storm he brought and the legend he became. Chapter 19. Europe transformed, the aftermath of the Scourge. The death of Attila the Hun in 453 was a turning point, not only for his empire, but for the entire continent. What had once seemed an unstoppable force, capable of crushing empires and terrifying generations, suddenly vanished. Yet the shadow of his campaigns lingered, and Europe would never be the same. The Hunnic Empire, which had stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the edges of Gaul and northern Italy, collapsed almost immediately. Attila's sons Elik, Denguzuk, and Ernik struggled to maintain the fragile alliances that their father had forged through fear and loyalty. Without his commanding presence, the coalition of tribes fractured. The Ostrogoths, Gepids, and other subjugated groups seized the opportunity to rebel, reclaiming territories and asserting independence. Within a few years, the empire that had dominated Europe disintegrated into chaos. Yet even as the Huns faded, the lands they had ravaged were permanently changed. Cities destroyed by fire were abandoned, fertile plains were trampled into wasteland, and populations scattered. Survivors fled, carrying stories of Attila's wrath and the destruction of entire settlements. The refugees' migrations created new pressures on neighboring regions, forcing tribes and kingdoms to adapt, relocate, or confront newcomers in bloody conflicts. In this way, Attila's campaigns reshaped the demographic and political map of Europe. The Western Roman Empire, already weakened by internal turmoil, now faced both relief and new challenges. Rome itself, spared from direct destruction by Attila's withdrawal, survived, but the western provinces had been devastated. Cities like Aquileia had been annihilated, leaving voids in administration and trade. The constant threat of Hunnic invasion had weakened Rome's military structure and exposed deep vulnerabilities. Even in victory, the empire was a shadow of its former glory. Meanwhile, the Germanic kingdoms were profoundly affected. The pressure from Hunnic expansion had forced tribes to move, unify, or fight. This led to the formation of stronger, more organized kingdoms, which would play crucial roles in the post-Roman world. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Franks were all shaped, in part, by the fear and destruction wrought by Attila. His campaigns had accelerated the decline of Roman authority and accelerated the rise of new powers across Europe. The psychological impact of Attila's campaigns cannot be overstated. To Romans, the Huns had been more than an enemy. They were a symbol of divine punishment. Priests called him the Scourge of God, a warning to humanity that empires could fall, that corruption would not go unpunished. For decades, his name was whispered in fear, a reminder of how one man could disrupt the balance of the known world. Even after his death, the terror he inspired remained. Stories of Attila became part of folklore, a mix of fact and myth that would endure for centuries. But Attila's legacy was not purely destructive. He had demonstrated the power of unity and organization among the tribes of the steppe. His ability to forge a coalition from diverse, and often rivalrous groups was unprecedented. The Huns were not simply raiders, they were a disciplined, highly mobile force capable of coordinated campaigns across vast distances. In this way, Attila's example influenced later military strategies and the political organization of nomadic peoples for generations to come. In addition, the movement of tribes caused by the Huns' campaigns indirectly reshaped Europe's geography and culture. Refugees founded new settlements, some of which would evolve into major cities. Trade routes shifted, alliances changed, and political boundaries were redrawn. The power vacuum left by the Huns allowed new leaders to emerge, shaping the medieval landscape that Europe would inhabit for centuries. Even in Rome, the fear of Attila influenced diplomacy and policy long after his death. Western emperors became more cautious in dealing with barbarian tribes, understanding that military might alone could no longer guarantee security. Tribute payments, political marriages, and negotiations became standard tools of diplomacy. The lesson of Attila was clear. Power was not only in the sword but also in reputation and fear. Across the steppe, the Huns themselves continued to exist, but in a weakened state. Without a strong leader, internal divisions led to the disintegration of central authority. Some groups merged with other tribes, some migrated further west or east, and others were absorbed into the kingdoms of Europe. The once mighty Huns became part of the larger tapestry of post-Roman Europe. Their legacy preserved more in memory and legend than in sustained political power. Yet, even as centuries passed, Attila's shadow persisted. Writers, historians, and chroniclers described him as a man of incredible cunning, ruthlessness, and ambition. Medieval texts recast him as a near-mythical figure, a king whose very name was a warning, a storm, and a symbol of unstoppable force. The Scourge of God became part of the European imagination, a figure who embodied the ultimate power of fear and destruction. The long-term consequences of Attila's campaigns were profound. The Hunnic invasions accelerated the decline of the Western Roman Empire. They forced the consolidation of Germanic kingdoms. They reshaped trade, migration, and political alliances. And they left a psychological imprint on Europe, a reminder of the fragility of power and the consequences of unchecked ambition. Attila the Hun had been a man of contradictions, brutal yet strategic, feared yet respected, ruthless yet capable of unity. His death ended his personal rule, but it did not end the transformations he had set in motion. Europe, scarred and reshaped, moved into a new era, forever influenced by the storm he had unleashed. And as history would remember, Attila's life was a lesson. Empires rise and fall, but legends endure. His name would echo across centuries, a symbol of terror, power, and the fleeting nature of human control. From the ashes of destruction, Europe began to rebuild, but the shadow of the Scourge of God would never fully fade. Chapter 20. The Legend of Attila, Fear that Transcends Time. Attila the Hun was gone, but he was not forgotten. His death in 453 marked the end of an empire built on fear, loyalty, and unstoppable force. But the echo of his life stretched across centuries. From the ashes of cities and shattered empires, his legend grew larger, darker, and more enduring than the man himself. Historians, chroniclers, and storytellers struggled to capture him. How do you describe a man who could inspire terror across nations? How do you explain an empire held together by fear and charisma, a coalition of tribes bound not by law, but by loyalty to one man? The records are fragmented, often contradictory, yet all agree on one thing. Attila was extraordinary. To the Romans, Attila remained the Scourge of God. He was a punishment for sin, a force of divine retribution, a warning that even the mightiest empire could crumble under the hand of a single, unstoppable warrior. Writers described him in apocalyptic terms: armies like rivers, eyes burning with fire, a presence that struck fear before a sword was even drawn. To speak his name was to invoke dread, yet in the eyes of his own people, the story was different. Among the Huns and allied tribes, Attila was a unifier, a leader, a man who had forged loyalty from chaos. He had organized a vast, diverse empire, maintained discipline among warriors, and rewarded those who served him. In their songs and stories, he was a king who had lifted them from scattered tribes into an unstoppable force, a figure whose genius lay not just in war, but in leadership. The contrast between these perspectives shaped the dual nature of his legend. To some, a monster. To others, a hero. To both, he was unforgettable. Even centuries later, his name continued to inspire fear and awe. Medieval chronicles portrayed him as a symbol of devastation, a warning of what unchecked ambition could achieve. Renaissance writers revisited his campaigns, dramatizing his victories and amplifying the terror he had inspired. He became a literary and historical touchstone, a figure who embodied the ultimate power of fear and reputation. Attila's influence also extended far beyond legend. The migrations and upheavals caused by his campaigns reshaped Europe. Tribes displaced by his armies sought new lands, forming alliances and conflicts that would determine the political landscape for generations. The fall of the Hunnic Empire accelerated the decline of the Western Roman Empire, paving the way for new kingdoms in Gaul, Italy, and beyond. The ripple effects of his life were profound, shaping both history and the imagination. In art, literature, and folklore, Attila became larger than life. Paintings depicted him as a towering figure, clad in furs and armor, commanding armies of the steppe. Poems and stories emphasized his ruthlessness, his strategic brilliance, and his seemingly supernatural ability to conquer. He was immortalized as the archetype of the barbarian conqueror, a man whose ambition knew no limits and whose fury spared nothing. But Attila's true legacy lies in the lessons his life teaches. He showed that fear can be as powerful as armies, that reputation can outmatch numerical strength, and that a single determined leader can reshape the world. He demonstrated the fragility of empires and the consequences of ignoring the power of unity among rival tribes. He revealed that leadership is both art and terror, and that history often remembers the impact of a name as much as the deeds behind it. Even today, his story resonates. Military leaders study his tactics. Historians debate his motivations. Writers and filmmakers dramatize his life, capturing the imagination of audiences worldwide. The fear he inspired, the empire he built, the legend he became, these are not relics of the past. They are a mirror reflecting humanity's fascination with power, ambition, and the shadow of destruction. The Huns themselves vanished from European history within decades, absorbed by other tribes or scattered across the steppes. Their empire crumbled, but Attila's name endured, a symbol of unstoppable force and relentless ambition. He became a cautionary tale and a mythic figure, bridging history and legend, mortal and immortal. In the end, Attila the Hun remains both a man and a myth, a force of history whose shadow extends far beyond the steppes he once ruled. His life reminds us that empires are fragile, that power can inspire terror as much as respect, and that one individual can leave a mark on the world that echoes across centuries. Attila conquered not just cities and nations, but fear itself. He reshaped Europe, forged legends, and ensured that his name would never be forgotten. The Scourge of God is gone, but the storm he created will forever linger in history's memory. And so, as the dust settles over the ruins of his empire, and the echoes of battle fade into legend, one truth remains. History remembers the names of those who terrify, those who conquer, and those who leave the world forever changed. Attila the Hun was all of these and more. The man is gone, but his legend endures. The story of Attila the Hun has come to an end, but the shadow he cast over history will never fade. A man who could strike terror into emperors, topple cities, and reshape continents is gone. Yet his name still echoes across time. The Scourge of God reminds us that power, fear, and ambition are forces that can change the world, leaving marks long after empires fall, from the steppes of Central Asia to the gates of Rome. Attila's life was a storm of violence, strategy, and legend. His empire may have crumbled, but the lessons of his reign endure, that one determined leader can bend the course of history, that fear is a weapon as powerful as any sword, and that legends often outlive the men who inspire them. If you want to uncover more dark chapters from history, subscribe to Dark History, hit the bell icon, and join us as we explore the shadows of the past. The past is darker than you think.